At this moment in our history, I feel it is very important to bring forward information for your consideration that I have compiled in past research with regards to the subjects of Marxism and Nazism as drivers of the New World Order agenda. My name is Michelle Gibson. What we see unfolding in the world today is coming from the exact same players that destroyed the old world and brought us their vision of the new world, which is quite dystopian in nature. We have long been deliberately manipulated towards an outcome that benefits the controllers to the detriment of humanity and all life on Earth, and it is becoming painfully clear that until something changes dramatically, and soon, it will not end well for us, as current headlines are showing us their playbook, which we've already seen in the worst chapters of modern history, and is very much with us today, and quite painful to see happening. This is just the tip of a very large iceberg. I'm going to go back through my research and bring forward a considerable amount of information that I have compiled on these subjects over the years. Those behind the New World Order agenda have lots of practice in divide and conquer, death, propaganda, gaslighting, and many other forms of perpetrating psychological abuse and trauma on individuals and the collective. I'm going to start with information that I came across when researching American financier George Peabody a few years back in the Secret Founding of America book by Nicholas Hager. The type of information found in this book is either hard to find in writing or hard to substantiate when found in writing, but it dovetails with other information I've been finding about this period in history. This paragraph, called Rothschild's Plan an American Central Bank, from page 73 of The Secret Founding of America, talks about Mayer Amschel Rothschild funding Adam Weishaupt's Order of the Illuminati in the 1770s, his 5 sons controlling banks in the major cities of Europe, the Rothschilds wanting to start a central bank in America, and several of the Rothschilds being behind the funding of both North and South in the planned division. Mayer Amschel Rothschild and his 5 sons established their international banking family dynasty throughout major cities of Europe. And this is a saying that has been attributed to more than one prominent member of the Rothschild family, starting with the first London family banker, Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Nathan Mayer Rothschild settled in Manchester, England in 1798 and established a business in textile trading and finance, and made a fortune in a banking enterprise he began in London in 1805 that dealt in foreign bills and government securities. Nathan had become a Freemason in London of the Emulation Lodge No. 12 of the Premier Grand Lodge of England in October of 1802. Adam Weishaupt established the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati on May 1st of 1776. Born in Ingolstadt, Germany, Weishaupt was educated by Jesuits starting at the age of 7 and was initiated into Freemasonry in Munich in 1777. Weishaupt's radical views on Illuminism got him in trouble with the ruler in Bavaria when writings of his were intercepted and deemed seditious, and he fled to the Duchy of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg under the protection of Duke Ernest II, starting in 1784, and died in Gotha in Germany in 1830. The lineage of the Duchy of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg eventually became the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, to which first cousins Queen Victoria and Prince Consort Albert both belonged, which became known to us as the House of Windsor in 1917. On page 174 of The Secret Founding of America, we find the name of Giuseppe Mazzini taking over the Illuminati in 1834. Queen Victoria's reign began on June 20th of 1837 and lasted for almost 64 years until her death on January 22nd of 1901. Her reign was described as a period of cultural, industrial, political, scientific, and military change within the United Kingdom, and marked by a great expansion of the British Empire. I firmly believe what we know of as the Victorian era was actually the official beginning of the New World Order timeline, with Queen Victoria presiding over its official kickoff at the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851. While considered relatively rare in the general population, hemophilia is an inherited bleeding disorder in which the blood does not clot properly and is prevalent in Europe's royal families, thereby gaining the nickname the royal disease, with the hemophilia gene said to have passed from Queen Victoria to the ruling families of Russia, Spain, and Germany. The presence of the hemophilia gene in Queen Victoria was said to have been caused by a spontaneous mutation, as she is considered the source of the disease in modern cases of hemophilia amongst her descendants. Well, for one thing, it looks like she was seeding the royal houses of Europe with her bloodline's DNA, and that for some reason, some of her descendants were born without the ability for their blood to clot, so bleeding stops. A rather famous case of this to come later in this video. Lord Palmerston served as Great Britain's Prime Minister during Queen Victoria's reign between 1855 and 1865, which was both the year of his death and the year the American Civil War came to an end. Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian politician, journalist, and revolutionary activist, had links with Lord Palmerston. Mazzini, who had founded a political movement for Italian youth under the age of 40 in 1831, according to the secret founding of America, Mazzini sent his right-hand man, Adriano Lemmi, and Louis Kossuth, head of the radical democratic wing of the Hungarian nationalists during the uprisings of 1848, to the United States to organize Young America lodges based on the same ideas. When I looked for information on the topic of Mazzini, Lemmo, and Kossuth, this is what I found, a passage titled, "The Ethnic Theme Parks of Mazzini's Zoo." Karl Marx also happened to be living in London during this same time frame, where he had moved in 1850 and was said to have his home base in London for the rest of his life. As a matter of fact, another German-born revolutionary socialist, Friedrich Engels, and Russian revolutionary socialist Vladimir Lenin, along with Karl Marx, all lived in London at some point in time. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published their pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, in 1848. The communism espoused by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels took root in Europe in the violent Russian Revolution of 1917 that marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and Russian imperial rule. Led by leftist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks seized power and would become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It is not hard to find Albert Pike's connection to Freemasonry in the historical record. Not at all. What is hard to find is Albert Pike's and Freemasonry's connection to historical events, and that is why I was so glad to find this, because there are other very interesting pieces of information that I have come across that point to a deep involvement in major events of the 20th century that are hard to substantiate. Albert Pike had several roles during the Civil War. As mentioned in The Secret Founding of America, Albert Pike became the most powerful Freemason in the world when he became the sovereign Grand Commander of the Southern jurisdiction. He secretly organized the rebellion in the Southern states, using this jurisdiction as a cover, and that most of the leadership of the Confederacy, both political and military, were Freemasons under Pike's secret command. One of the first times in my research that I came across Albert Pike's name in connection with the Civil War was finding out that he was a senior officer in the Confederate Army who commanded the District of Indian Territory, what later became known as Oklahoma, in the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the American Civil War. The Trans-Mississippi Theater of the Civil War covered everything west of the Mississippi River as pictured here. We are told that there were altogether 7 battles in Arkansas, New Mexico, Missouri, and Louisiana between 1862 and 1864 in the Trans-Mississippi Theater of War. Another significant but obscure historical event to note in Paris was the Paris Commune. The short-lived Paris Commune was formally established on March 28th of 1871 and was a radical socialist, anti-religious, and revolutionary government that ruled Paris until it was suppressed by the French army in May of 1871. What happened in the Paris Commune was closely followed by London resident Karl Marx, who published a pamphlet in June of 1871 called The Civil War in France, about the significance of the struggle of the communards in the Paris Commune. The year of 1871 was also the year the U.S. Congress passed the District of Columbia Organic Act, which repealed the charters of the cities of Washington and Georgetown and established a new territorial government for the District of Columbia. This created a single municipal government for the federal district, which was incorporated, defined as the process of constituting a company, city, or other organization as a legal corporation. Thus, the 1871 U.S. corporation was born, which opened the door for ownership by foreign interests. And lastly, 1871 was the year that Albert Pike wrote a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, revolutionary activist and the second leader of the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati after Adam Weishaupt's death in 1830. I had previously encountered 3 graphics in my research displaying quotes from this letter that appear to be the military blueprints for World Wars I, II, and III. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to go through historical events associated with each of the 3 quotes and provide some answers to whether or not all of these conflicts, at least since the American Civil War, and other wars of the 19th and 20th centuries, have been planned, even scripted out, and staged for the controller's desired outcome, which was world control and domination. I will be looking at the very real possibility that the Earth's population has been experiencing a very calculated and undeclared psychological war based on terror and trauma against all of humanity for a very long time to bring us to what is going on against humanity in the world in which we live in today. Hopefully in this process, I will be able to shine some light on this vast subject of what might have taken place here that is available to find in a search, that in some way, shape, and form provides a plausible explanation for how we have gotten to this point. Jack London, born in San Francisco on January 12th of 1876, was one of the first writers to have worldwide fame and great financial success. He was also an advocate of socialism. Jack London was said to have had Marxist beliefs, espousing a progression from feudalism through capitalism, then socialism, and ending in a period without a state known as communism. He published a book in 1908 called The Iron Heel about the rise of an oligarchic tyranny in the United States. An oligarchy is a form of power structure in which power rests with a small number of people. The storyline emphasized future changes in society and politics, and not technological changes. It is called a dystopian novel, meaning characterized by mass poverty, public mistrust and suspicion, and a police state or oppression. So with regards to the first quote on the First World War, Pike was talking about the Illuminati overthrowing the czars and making Russia a fortress of atheistic communism. World War I started after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive to the throne of Austria-Hungary, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph. He was assassinated by Bosnian Serb student Gavrilo Princip. He was a member of Young Bosnia, a revolutionary movement active in Bosnia-Herzegovina inspired by anarchism and socialism. Within a short period of time, war was declared between Austria-Hungary and Serbia and their respective alliances. The alliances of Austria-Hungary were Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, or Central Powers, and the alliances of Serbia were Great Britain, France, Russia, Romania, Italy, Japan, and the United States, otherwise known as Allied Powers. Among many other things, World War I saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction due to things like the horrors of trench warfare and new military technologies. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28th of 1919 and ended World War I. What became known as the War Guilt Clause of the treaty required Germany, and the other Central Powers as well, to accept responsibility for causing all the loss and damage during the war. Germany was required to disarm, make ample territorial concessions, and pay reparations to certain countries. The former empire of Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and new nations were created: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Austria. The Ottoman Empire was also on the losing side of the war. At the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was partitioned and lost its Middle East holdings, which were divided between the Allied forces. Thus, at the end of World War I, the victorious powers divided up the Ottoman Empire, and it existed no more, and within 5 years the Republic of Turkey, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, was established in 1923. The violent Russian Revolution of 1917 marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and Russian imperial rule. Led by leftist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks seized power and would become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It is important to note that the last Empress of Russia, as spouse of the last Emperor Nicholas II, Alexandra Fyodorovna, was a favorite granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a carrier of the hemophilia gene. Her name at birth was Princess Alix of Hesse and by Rhine, and the daughter of the Grand Duke of Hesse, Louis IV, and Princess Alice of the United Kingdom. For a variety of reasons, including being German in a Russian court and not understanding all the traditions and subtleties, she was unpopular both with the extended imperial family and the general public, and Nicholas II had popularity issues with his people as well. Their only son, Alexei Nikolaevich, was heir to the imperial throne and a hemophiliac. Since the incurable disease threatened the life of their only son and heir, the crown decided to keep his condition from the public. Alexandra brought in Siberian mystic Grigory Rasputin, who appeared to have a cure after conventional medicine failed to improve her son's condition. As a result, he became powerful in the Russian imperial court, and the Empress Alexandra turned a blind eye to his drinking and debauchery, and his presence harmed their imperial prestige. He joined the court in 1906, and was able to exert considerable influence over Russian imperial affairs until 1916, when a group of noblemen who opposed his influence over Nicholas and Alexandra assassinated him. World War I added fuel to the fire. Emperor Nicholas II ended up abdicating his throne on March 12 of 1917, and the Duma, a nonviolent provisional government, formed. Then in November of 1917, which was October in the Julian calendar, Lenin and his Bolsheviks seized control of the Duma. Civil war broke out in Russia after this took place between the warring Red Army and White Army, which was composed of loosely allied forces of monarchists, capitalists, and supporters of democratic socialism. It wasn't enough for the emperor to abdicate. He, his entire family, and the retainers who accompanied them were violently put to death by the Bolsheviks on July 16th of 1918. Though there have been persisting rumors that his daughter Anastasia might have somehow survived. The Russian Civil War ended in 1923 with Lenin's Red Army claiming victory and establishing the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution established communism as an influential political belief system around the world, and set the stage for the rise of communism as a world power that would go head-to-head with the United States during the Cold War. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration was issued by the British government during the First World War, announcing the support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, written by the Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. The Weimar Republic, officially called the German Reich, was a German federal state from 1918 to 1933, and the period between the end of the imperial period and the beginning of Nazi Germany in 1933. The years of the Weimar Republic were characterized by economic troubles, weak government, and by decadent parties. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed at the end of the First World War, Germany lost its overseas colonies and some important international trade routes. Tea and tobacco supplies dried up quickly, but almost all drugs, including cocaine and heroin, were legal to buy. Thus the city of Berlin was awash with drugs, and gender rules were smashed altogether. Many Germans were financially ruined at the end of World War I. Prostitution was deregulated, and in the 1920s the streets of Berlin were filled with prostitutes of all ages needing to make a living. And it wasn't just women. Cabarets and dance halls in Berlin were booming in Weimar Germany, with hard drugs frequently given to customers for free upon entrance. Androgyny was all the rage in Berlin cabarets, with some of the most popular acts being male and female impersonators. Very similar to Las Vegas, Nevada today, with free drinks and drag shows. The 1933 German movie Viktor und Viktoria was about a woman pretending to be a female impersonator whose agent mistakenly believed she was a man. was remade in 1982 into Victor and Victoria by Blake Edwards. The Weimar Republic ended in 1933 with the rise to power of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and its leader Adolf Hitler becoming Chancellor, ruling Germany through totalitarian means until 1945, the year World War II ended. Founded in 1919, the Nazi Party promoted German pride and were unhappy with the terms of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles that required Germany to make concessions and reparations. Pan-Germanist groups, starting in the late 18th century, sought to unify all German-speaking people into a single nation-state. The Reichstag houses the Bundestag, or the lower house of the German parliament. The construction of the original Reichstag, or Imperial Diet of the German Empire, was said to have begun in 1884 and completed in 1894. The Reichstag fire in February of 1933 was considered an act of arson and took place 4 weeks after Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. As a result of the Reichstag fire event, the Reichstag Fire Decree was issued in 1933, which suspended civil liberties of German citizens. The decree was used as the legal basis for the imprisonment of anyone considered to be opponents of the Nazis and/or suppressing opposition publications. The Heim ins Reich, or back home to the Reich, was a foreign policy starting in 1938 by Hitler and pursued during the course of World War II. His goal was to convince all ethnic Germans living in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the western districts of Poland that they should strive to bring these regions home to Greater Germany. While there was still resistance within Austria to annexation with Germany and the dissolution of the Austrian state in the early 1930s, agents cultivated pro-Austrian tendencies there, and the stage was ultimately set for the German Wehrmacht to enter Austria without opposition by the Austrian army on March 12th of 1938, and a referendum officially ratified the annexation, or Anschluss, of Austria to Germany's Third Reich on April 10th of 1938. For the Second World War, Pike talked about taking advantage of the differences between fascists and Zionists, destroying Nazism, Zionism creating Israel, and communism being strong enough to control Christendom. World War II completely ended on September 2nd of 1945, almost 6 years to the day of the beginning of the war on September 1st of 1939. The General Plan Ost was the Nazi government plan for genocide and ethnic cleansing on a vast scale, and the colonization of Central and Eastern Europe by Germany directly and indirectly led to the deaths of millions by shootings, starvation, disease, and extermination through labor and genocide. And there is actually a precedent here that I found in my research for what I'm talking about. This photo is designated to be one of survivors of the Herero and Namaqua genocide circa 1907. The Herero and Namaqua genocide was the first genocide of the 20th century and waged by the German Empire between 1904 and 1908 against the Herero, the Nama, and the San peoples in what was German Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. And in 1985, the United Nations Whitaker Report determined that the aftermath was an attempt to exterminate these people of Southwest Africa. These are Herero women pictured here. There were an estimated number of deaths between 24,000 and 100,000 for the Herero, 10,000 for the Nama, and an unknown number of deaths for the San, of which the ones that didn't die from starvation and dehydration in the Namibian desert when they were driven there by German army forces were placed in concentration camps where they died from diseases, abuse, and exhaustion. The San, also known as Bushmen, are considered the oldest inhabitants of southern Africa, with a history there said to date back at least 20,000 years, and are among the oldest peoples in the world. The body responsible for the General Plan Ost during World War II was the Reich Main Security Office of the SS under the direction of Himmler, the main architect behind the Holocaust, and overseer of the building of concentration camps. A prosecution witness at the Nuremberg trials, who had been a trusted Obergruppenführer in the planning stages, reported that Himmler openly said, as the General Plan Ost was being formulated, "It is a question of existence. Thus it will be a racial struggle of pitiless severity, in the course of which 20 to 30 million Slavs and Jews will perish through military action and the crises of food supply. The wartime documentation of the General Plan Ost, part of the Drang nach Osten, or Drive to the East ideology of German expansion, was destroyed shortly before Hitler's defeat in 1945, but many of the essential elements of it was reconstructed from memos, abstracts, and other documents. According to what I could find out, the final solution was the Nazi plan for the genocide of the Jews during World War II and code for the murder of all Jews within reach. This policy for systematic genocide was formulated at the Wannsee Conference of 1942 near Berlin and resulted in the killing of 90% of Poland's Jews and two-thirds of the Jewish population of Europe. Europe's gypsies were targeted populations as well. This is the primary information that's come down to us about the history of the final solution and the Holocaust. But when you add the numbers for the Slavic populations affected by the General Plan Ost, the numbers for targeted genocide and so-called ethnic cleansing go up astronomically. And who exactly was being ethnically cleansed with regards to the Jews and the Slavs? We typically think of the European Jews and Slavs looking like this as the only victims because we have no other information about the race of the Jews and the Slavic peoples. But you can't really tell when you have a pile of bones like you see in this photo from the Majdanek concentration camp in Poland. The first of the big three wartime conferences, the Tehran Conference, was actually held in November of 1943, in which the Allies committed to open a second front against Nazi Germany, and 2 years after the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in August of 1941. Reza Shah Pahlavi was deposed in September of 1941 as a result of the British and Soviet invasion of Iran during World War II, because he was seen as a German ally, even though Iran had maintained neutrality in the conflict, and the invasion took place purportedly to secure Iran's oil fields and ensure Allied supply lines along the Persian corridor. He was replaced as Shah by his young son at the time, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran. The next of the big three wartime conferences was the Yalta Conference, which was held between February 4th and 11th of 1945 near Yalta in Crimea, a peninsula on the northern coast of the Black Sea in what was the Soviet Union at the time. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to discuss the post-war reorganization of Germany and Europe. Much was agreed to by the Big Three at the Yalta Conference, but what I want to highlight is the Declaration of Liberated Europe, the ratification of the agreement of the European Advisory Commission, and the groundwork for the United Nations. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was created by the leaders of the three nations as a promise to allow the people to create democratic institutions of their own choice, and pledged the earliest possible establishment through elections, governments responsive to the will of the people. So this is what they all said, but what actually happened? The European Advisory Commission, or EAC, allowed each occupying power full control over its occupying zone, and the subsequent Cold War was reflected in the partition of Germany, as each occupying force could develop its zone on its own without influence from any overseeing body. With regard to the formal establishment of the United Nations in San Francisco in June of 1945, all the parties at the Yalta Conference agreed to an American plan concerning voting procedures in the Security Council, which had expanded to 5 permanent members, which were with the inclusion of France, China, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It was only 6 months after the Japanese surrender that Winston Churchill proclaimed that an Iron Curtain had descended across Central Europe. On the east side of the curtain were the countries connected to or influenced by the Soviet Union, while on the west side were the countries that were NATO members or nominally neutral. The third Big Three wartime conference was held in Potsdam, Germany between July 17th and August 2nd in 1945. They gathered to decide how to administer Germany after its unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier on May 8th of 1945. Franklin Roosevelt's death occurred on April 12th of 1945, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, succeeded him and represented the United States as president at the Potsdam Conference. And on July 28th, the new Prime Minister Clement Attlee replaced Winston Churchill as the representative for Great Britain at the Potsdam Conference. A number of changes had occurred since the Yalta Conference that greatly impacted Big Three relations in Potsdam. By the time of the Potsdam Conference, the Soviet Union occupied Central and Eastern Europe, with the Red Army effectively controlling Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, claiming this region was a legitimate sphere of Soviet influence, as well as a defensive measure against future attacks. Outcomes of the Potsdam Conference included, but was not limited to, the division of Germany and Austria into 4 occupation zones, with their capitals of Berlin and Vienna divided into 4 zones as well, the prevention of Nazi activity and preparation for the reconstruction of Germany into a democratic state, the decision to put Nazi war criminals on trial, war reparations to Allied countries, and the dismantling of Germany's war industry. It is important to note that during the same time period as the Potsdam Conference, the United States successfully tested the first atomic bomb on July 16th at Trinity Site near Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Potsdam Declaration was issued on July 26, an ultimatum calling for the surrender of all Japanese forces, or Japan would face prompt and utter destruction. Whether or not this actually happened as advertised, we are told that by August 5th of 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, destroying the city and killing over 70,000 people, and that the second atomic bomb was dropped on the shipbuilding center of Nagasaki on August 9th, several days later, killing around the same number of people as Hiroshima. Japan formally surrendered on August 15th of 1945, with the formal treaty signed on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd of 1945. The Potsdam Declaration was intended by the Big Three to be the legal basis for administering Japan after the war, and after Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Japan, General Douglas MacArthur, landed there in September, it served as a legal basis of the occupation's reforms. While the Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain on the imperial throne, the Japanese constitution was completely overhauled, and the emperor's powers became strictly limited by law, and a parliamentary democracy was installed as the new form of government. Also, after the August 15th surrender of Japan in 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel into 2 zones of occupation, with the Soviets administering the northern half and the Americans the southern half. In 1948, as a result of Cold War tensions, the occupation zones became 2 sovereign states, Socialist North Korea and Capitalist South Korea. The governments of the 2 new Korean states both claimed to be the only legitimate Korean government, and neither accepted the border as permanent. The beginnings of the Cold War are firmly rooted in the events of 1945. Lasting from the formulation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was called Cold because there was no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union, but engaged instead in proxy wars by supporting different sides of major regional conflicts. Truman was much more suspicious of the Soviets than Roosevelt had been, and saw Soviet actions in Central and Eastern Europe as aggressive expansionism. President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine to Congress on March 12 of 1947, where he asked for money to contain the communist uprisings in Greece and Turkey. It was an American foreign policy which had the stated purpose of containing Soviet geopolitical expansion and generally considered the start of the Cold War. It led to the formation of NATO in 1949, a military alliance between Western nations that still exists today. The Warsaw Pact was signed in 1955 as a counterbalance to NATO between the Soviet Union and 7 other Eastern Bloc social republics of Central and Eastern Europe, and created in reaction to the integration of West Germany into NATO. Aside from nuclear arsenal development under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, said to have been intended to discourage a preemptive attack by either side, and conventional military deployment, the struggle for dominance between the United States and the Soviet Union was expressed by psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, espionage, rivalry at sporting events, and the space race. Let's see what's going on in other parts of the world in the mid-1940s. In China, the Chinese Civil War was fought off and on between the Nationalist Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party from 1927 to 1949. Hostilities were being put on hold between 1937 and 1945, when the two factions united in the face of the Japanese invasion of China and establishment of its puppet state, Manchukuo. Generally referred to as the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Communists gained control of mainland China in 1949, forcing the leadership of the Nationalist Republic of China to retreat to the island of Taiwan. Now, with regards to the creation of the State of Israel, Great Britain had been granted a colonial mandate for Palestine and Transjordan by the League of Nations on April 25th of 1920, which lasted until the formation of Israel in May of 1948. A League of Nations mandate was a legal status for certain territories transferred from the control of one country to another after World War I, in this case territories that were conceded by the Ottoman Empire following the end of World War I in 1918. For the Third World War, Pike talked about the Illuminati taking advantage of the differences between Zionist and Islamic leaders so they mutually destroy each other. I think World War III, as described here by Albert Pike, has been going on for a very long time, at least since the end of World War II, and is very much happening in the present day. People are living in a state of war, also involving psychological warfare, in addition to physical conflicts, without even being aware of it, because of course we haven't been told that we are. Before I move on from World War II and from Nazism into Marxism, I would like to insert my belief the Nazis were actually in existence long before World War II, and that they were not defeated in World War II as we have been taught. They have committed an unfathomable number of crimes against humanity, continuing well into the present day, and have robbed us of our true history and heritage, and humanity has no value to them except as an energy source and commodity. They hate us and at the same time need us for their survival and wealth, and have been planning a Fourth Reich. I have read where some believe that instead of Hitler committing suicide along with Eva Braun in a Berlin bunker on April 30th of 1945, they escaped to Argentina in 1945. And while not widely known to the general public, Operation Paperclip was a U.S. intelligence program which brought Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States following the end of the Second World War. It is interesting to note here that present-day Ukraine was roughly the location of the Khazarian Empire, which was said to have existed between 650 AD and 969 AD, and where the ruling elite converted to Judaism in the 8th century. And some believe that the Ashkenazi Jews originated from the Khazarian Jews, who had a fearsome reputation. I wonder if there could be a connection to Ashkenazi. The same word is actually in the name. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but then again, maybe it isn't a coincidence. And the globalists behind the New World Order agenda still meet on a regular basis to make and implement their plans for their global takeover of the world's finances, resources, and people. They are a small number of related elitist family bloodlines, hidden in different nationalities and religions, to carry out their plans for world domination. So, at the end of World War II, the United States and Britain took up the Zionist cause, and the issue of forming Israel was referred to the United Nations, which voted to partition Palestine in November of 1947. The modern state of Israel was proclaimed on May 14th of 1948, with its origins in the 19th century Zionist movement of Ashkenazi Jews who called for the establishment of a territorial Jewish state. Despite growing conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Jews, Truman ultimately decided to recognize Israel. David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the modern state of Israel on May 14th of 1948, and President Truman recognized the new nation on the same day. Also on the same day, the new state of Israel was proclaimed, and the British army withdrawn. Gunfire broke out between Jews and Arabs, and Egypt had launched an air assault that evening. A little over a month after the establishment of the modern state of Israel, the Berlin blockade took place starting on June 24th of 1948 and lasted until May 12th of 1949. It was one of the first major international crises of the Cold War. The Soviet Union blocked the Western Allies' power, railway, road, and canal access to the sectors in Berlin under Western control during the multinational occupation of Berlin. In response, the Western Allies organized the Berlin Airlift, which lasted from June 26 of 1948 to September 30th of 1949, to carry supplies to the people of West Berlin, flying over 200,000 sorties in 1 year to provide the people of West Berlin food and fuel. The Korean War started in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th, following clashes along the border and insurrections in the South. North Korea was supported by China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea by the United Nations, principally from the United States. The Korean War ended in 1953, during which time there was a back and forth going on. Seoul was captured numerous times, and communist forces were pushed back to the 38th parallel numerous times, creating a stalemate in the ground war. From the air, North Korea was subject to a massive U.S. bombing campaign, and the Soviets flew in covert missions in defense of their communist allies. The Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27 of 1953, ending the fighting, creating the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, to separate North and South Korea, and allowing for the return of prisoners. No peace treaty was signed, however, and the two Koreas are still technically at war in a frozen conflict. The Korean War was one of the most destructive conflicts of modern times, with around 3 million deaths due to the war, and proportionally a larger civilian death toll than either World War II or the Vietnam War, caused the destruction of nearly all of Korea's major cities, and there were thousands of massacres on both sides. The Geneva Conference was convened in 1954 in Geneva, Switzerland, to settle unresolved issues from the Korean War and the First Indochina War in Vietnam, and attended by representatives from the United States, France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China, as well as from Korea and Vietnam. The Geneva Conference was held in the Palace of Nations, the home of the United Nations office in Geneva, and said to have been built between 1929 and 1938 to serve as the headquarters of the League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations. While no declarations or proposals were adopted with regards to the Korean situation, the Geneva Accords that dealt with the dismantling of French Indochina would have major ramifications. The French military forces in Vietnam, formerly part of French Indochina, had been decisively defeated on May 7th of 1954 by the Communist Viet Minh forces under Ho Chi Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The very next day, the discussions on French Indochina began at the Geneva Conference, and the Western Allies did not have a unified position on what the conference was to achieve in relation to French Indochina. The Geneva Accords established North and South Vietnam with the 17th parallel as the dividing line, and the French agreed to remove their troops from North Vietnam. The agreement also stipulated that elections were to be held within 2 years to unify Vietnam under a single democratic government. These elections never happened. The non-communist puppet government set up by the French in South Vietnam refused to sign. The United States also refused to sign on, with the belief that national elections would result in an overwhelming victory for the communist Ho Chi Minh, who had so decisively defeated the French colonialists. Within a year, the United States helped establish a new anti-communist government in South Vietnam and began giving it financial and military assistance. A mass migration took place after Vietnam was divided. Estimates of upwards of 3 million people left communist North Vietnam for South Vietnam, going into refugee status in their own country, and many were assisted by the United States Navy during Operation Passage to Freedom. An estimated 52,000 people moved from South to North Vietnam, mostly Viet Minh members and their families. The Chinese occupation of Tibet started in 1950, when China invaded Tibet and engaged in a military campaign at the Battle of Chamdo to take the Chamdo region from an independent Tibetan state, one of 3 traditional provinces of Tibet, along with Amdo and Utsang. As a result, Chamdo was captured by the Chinese, and Tibet was eventually annexed when the State Council of the People's Republic of China dissolved Tibet on March 28 of 1959, and it became known as the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China in 1965. Since that time, over 1 million Tibetans have been killed, and monks, nuns, and lay people who protest ending up as political prisoners who are tortured and held in substandard conditions. China has a policy of resettlement of Chinese citizens to Tibet. Chinese is the official language, and Tibetans have become a minority in their own country. Tibet's spiritual and temporal leader, the 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso, and other Tibetan refugees escaped to Dharamsala in India during the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, where he established the Central Tibetan Administration, the Tibetan government in exile, which is not recognized by China. Joseph Stalin passed away in 1953. The guy who was so chummy with the other leaders at the Big Three wartime conferences is remembered by history as a brutal dictator. Stalin rose to power in 1924 after Lenin's death and ruled by terror with a series of brutal policies which left countless millions of his own citizens dead. Between 1928 and 1940, Stalin enforced the collectivization of the agricultural sector by stripping people who owned land and livestock of their holdings, forcing people to join collective farms, and rounding up and executing higher-income farmers and confiscating their land. Instead of increasing the food supply, this policy caused food shortages, which in turn led to what was called the Great Famine between 1932 and 1933, with millions of people perishing from starvation. The height of Stalin's terror campaign was known as the Great Purge, taking place between 1936 and 1938, during which time an estimated 600,000 Soviet citizens were executed, and millions more were deported or imprisoned in forced labor camps known as gulags. Not a nice man. Neither was Chairman Mao, who was doing much the same kinds of things to his people in China. For one example, Mao and the Chinese Communist Party launched the Great Leap Forward in 1958 for the citizenry to industrialize China by the mass mobilization of the country's population into agriculturally based communes to increase grain supply. It had the same effect as forced farming collectives had in the Soviet Union, resulting in the Great Chinese Famine, with an estimated number of deaths ranging between 15 and 55 million, the largest in history, not to mention that researchers give up to 3 million people being tortured to death or executed for violating the policy. Senator Joseph McCarthy became the public face of a period of time in which Cold War tensions propelled fears of widespread communist subversion in the United States. In 1950, McCarthy, one of the U.S. senators from Wisconsin, said he had the names of 205 communists working at the State Department, which prompted the Senate to form a special committee to look into the allegations, the outcome of which was said to not find much supporting evidence. When he became chair of the Senate Permanent Investigations Subcommittee in 1952, McCarthy called more than 500 people before the committee for questioning, people in the federal government, universities, the film industry, and elsewhere. He was ultimately censured by the Senate in 1945 for conduct unbecoming a senator. The definition of McCarthyism is making baseless accusations of subversion or treason without any proper regard for evidence, especially when referring to communism. A lot of what we see playing out in our world right now makes me wonder if these claims about communist infiltrators was baseless or actually based in fact. The short-lived Hungarian uprising took place from October 23rd of 1956 to November 10th of 1956 against Soviet control and policies, and was the first major threat to Soviet control since the Red Army drove Nazi Germany from its territory at the end of World War II. The symbol of it was the Hungarian flag with the communist emblem cut out. Starting out as a student protest, the movement turned into a much larger revolt, and the government collapsed, and thousands organized themselves in militias battling the Hungarian army and Soviet troops. The revolution was ultimately crushed when a large Soviet force invaded Hungary, and by January of 1957, a new Soviet-installed government had suppressed all opposition. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was an invasion of Egypt by Israel, followed by the British and French, to regain control of the Suez Canal and remove Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had just nationalized the canal, which prior to that was owned primarily by Britain and France. The The invasion was quickly stopped upon political pressure from the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations. Britain and France were humiliated, and Nasser was strengthened. Fidel Castro came to power in 1959 after overthrowing Cuban President Fulgencio Batista via guerrilla warfare and subsequently assuming military and political power as Cuba's prime minister. He was ideologically a Marxist-Leninist and Cuban nationalist, and under his administration, Cuba became the first one-party communist state in the Western Hemisphere. The United States opposed Castro's government, and Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union. On March 6th of 1960, it was announced that 3,500 American soldiers were going to be sent to Vietnam for the first time, after North Vietnam escalated military operations against South Vietnam. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered the Berlin Wall to be built in 1961 after 160,000 East German refugees crossed into West Berlin following major food shortages. As already mentioned, during the Yalta Big Three conference held in February of 1945, the European Advisory Commission, or EAC, allowed each occupying power full control over its occupying zone, and the subsequent Cold War was reflected in the partition of Germany, as each occupying force could develop its zone on its own without influence from any overseeing body. Berlin was split into similar sectors. The Soviets took the eastern half, while the other Allies took the western. Subsequently, in August of 1961, the Communist government of East Germany, also known as the German Democratic Republic, began to build a wall of concrete and barbed wire between East Berlin and West Berlin. It was built ostensibly to prevent Western fascists from entering the country, but the even bigger reason was to contain the citizens of East Berlin and made it harder for them to leave, not that they didn't try. Once the wall was constructed, the only access between East Berlin and West Berlin was via 3 checkpoints, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. The Cuban Missile Crisis started on the 16th of October in 1962 and ended a little over a month later. It was a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is considered the closest the two countries came to full-scale nuclear war, when the Soviet Union deployed nuclear ballistic missiles to Cuba as a response to the United States deploying nuclear ballistic missiles to Italy and Turkey. An agreement was reached between Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro to place the missiles on the island in the summer of 1962 at Castro's request to deter future invasions, and the construction of missile sites on Cuba was confirmed by U-2 spy plane photos. After consulting with the National Security Council, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba on October 22nd in order to stop further missiles from reaching Cuba. The blockade was formally lifted on November 20th of 1962 after negotiations between the United States and Soviet Union resulted in the dismantling of their offensive weapons. Other examples of civil wars started in Africa following their independence from European colonization included the country of Sudan. Sudan gained independence from the joint rule of Britain and Egypt on January 1st of 1956. The First Sudanese Civil War lasted for 17 years, from the time tensions started to develop in 1955 to the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972 between the northern part of Sudan and the southern Sudan region that wanted representation and more regional autonomy. During that 17-year period, over 500,000 people are estimated to have died. This is what we are told. The British government administered the primarily Muslim and Arab northern Sudan and mostly Christian and animist southern Sudan as separate regions under international sovereignty until 1956, at which time the two regions were merged into a single administrative region as part of the British strategy in the Middle East, and without the consultation of the minority southern leaders who were fearful of being absorbed into northern Sudan, for whom the British had shown favoritism, and tensions between the North and South escalated between the two. Following Sudan's independence from Britain, the southern ruling class were powerless in the merged politics and government of Sudan compared to the northern ruling class and unable to address the injustices against their people. Hostilities escalated, characterized by insurgencies and political turmoil, including infighting between Marxist and non-Marxist factions in the ruling military class. Civil war started in Guatemala in 1960 between the government and leftist rebel groups supported by the Maya and Ladinos, a distinct Spanish-speaking ethnic group who comprised the rural poor in Guatemala. Civil wars in Guatemala lasted until 1996. The military forces of the Guatemalan government have been condemned for genocide of the Maya and for widespread human rights violations against civilians, with some of the context being long-standing issues of unfair land distribution. Companies such as the American United Fruit Company controlled much of the land in Guatemala, conflicting with the rural poor. The United Fruit Company monopolized all of Guatemala's banana production and export, as well as owning the country's telegraph and telephone system, and most of its railroad track. The United Fruit Company has been described as an exploitative multinational corporation that influenced the economic and political development of these countries in a deep and enduring way. It is interesting to note that in 1897, 2 years before the United Fruit Company was formed, the Central American Exposition was held in Guatemala. We are told it was constructed to highlight the railroad between Iztapa on the Pacific coast and Puerto Barrios on the Atlantic coast, but that for a variety of reasons, including the railroad not being finished at the time of the exposition, it was considered a dramatic failure for Guatemala. In Vietnam, by the time of John F. Kennedy's death in November of 1963, there were 16,000 American military personnel, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident took place in 1964, an international confrontation after which the United States engaged more directly in the Vietnam War. The first Gulf of Tonkin incident took place on August 2nd of 1964 between ships of North Vietnam and the United States. The description of what took place is as follows. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached the naval destroyer USS Maddox and attacked it with torpedoes and machine gun fire. Damages said to have come about as a result of the ensuing battle were 1 U.S. aircraft, all 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and 4 North Vietnamese deaths, and 1 bullet hole on the naval destroyer, and no American deaths. There was initially allegedly a second incident on August 4th of 1964. This second occurrence has long been said not to have taken place. And then there are the people who believe the first Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened either. Whether or not the Gulf of Tonkin incidents actually happened, they were used as an excuse for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by Congress on August 7th of 1964, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson authority to help any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be in jeopardy of communist aggression, and was considered the legal justification for the beginning of open warfare with North Vietnam and the deployment of American troops to Southeast Asia, of which, with the institution of the draft, there were over 500,000 troops sent by 1966. Even the country neighboring Vietnam in Southeast Asia, Laos, had its own problems with the Vietnam War spilling over, with Laos being bombed by American planes starting in 1964, in retaliation, we are told, for the shooting down of an American plane by insurgents, and after which bombing runs over Laos intensified, with over 100,000 bombing runs on Laos's eastern border with North Vietnam. Between 1964 and 1973, the megalithic plain of Jars in Laos was heavily bombed by the U.S. Air Force operating against the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao communist forces, and it was said that the Air Force dropped more bombs on the plain of Jars than it dropped during the entirety of World War II. These were some unexploded bombs removed from the plain of Jars from the secret war in Laos. Per capita, Laos is the most bombed country in history. The Vietnam War ended with the fall of Saigon on April 30th of 1975, when the capital of South Vietnam was captured by North Vietnamese forces, and the beginnings of the reunification of Vietnam into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Cultural Revolution in China lasted from 1966 to 1976. It was a violent social and political purge under Mao, Communist Party of China chairman, with the stated goal of removing traditional and capitalist elements from Chinese society in order to preserve Chinese communism. Soon, Chairman Mao called on young people to bombard the headquarters in schools, factories, and government institutions, apparently in order to eliminate his rivals within the Communist Party of China. He insisted that middle-class elements in Chinese society who wanted to restore capitalism be removed through violent class struggle. The death of Chairman Mao in 1976 ended the Cultural Revolution. During this 10-year period, there was an estimated death toll of somewhere between hundreds of thousands to 20 million, and severely damaged China's economy and traditional culture. The Six-Day War between Israel and the neighboring Arab states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria took place in June of 1967. By the end of the Six-Day War, Israel had gotten control of the Sinai Peninsula and the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. Civil war started in Cambodia in 1967 as well, and lasted until 1975. It was a war fought between the government forces of the Kingdom of Cambodia under Prince Sihanouk and the forces of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, known as the Khmer Rouge, supported by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. Cambodia is in Southeast Asia, sandwiched between Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Prince Sihanouk's policies in the early 1960s initially protected his nation from the turmoil that engulfed Vietnam and Laos. His balancing act eventually went awry with all the forces at play during that time, and ultimately the Khmer Rouge seized power in 1975, and Prince Sihanouk was exiled. Between 1975 and 1979, Cambodia was ruled by Pol Pot, General Secretary of the Communist Party, and his Khmer Rouge Party, leading to the genocide of the Cambodian people, considered to be one of the bloodiest in history, in which an estimated 1.5 to 2 million deaths occurred, in part due to Pol Pot's goals of turning Cambodia into a socialist agrarian republic by forced relocation of its people to labor camps in the countryside. Many people were just taken out into fields and summarily executed, giving us the name of the Killing Fields, the title of a 1984 film about the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, based on the experiences of two journalists, one Cambodian and one American. The 1972 Munich Olympics are remembered for the occurrence of the Black September Palestinian terrorist attack, the second week of the Olympics, in which 8 terrorists took 9 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage, after killing 2 of the team's members and a West German police officer. I remember this happening very well. I was 9 years old at the time and enjoying watching the Olympic Games. Then this happened. The Palestinian terrorists demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, and the West German-held founders of the German far-left militant group Red Army faction, Baader and Meinhof. 5 of the 8 Black September terrorists were killed in a failed attempt to rescue the demanded hostages. The 3 surviving terrorists were arrested, but then released in a hostage exchange following the hijacking of Lufthansa Flight 615, a Palestinian terror attack aimed at securing the release of the 3 surviving terrorists. When the 3 Palestinian prisoners were released, the Israeli government authorized Operation Wrath of God to track them down and kill them. 2 out of the 3 were believed to have been killed. The Yom Kippur War was fought between Israel and a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria from October 6 to October 25 of 1973. Egypt led a surprise attack into the Sinai, territory it had lost to Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967, and Syria unsuccessfully focused on ridding the Golan Heights of its Israeli soldiers. There was an Israeli counterattack, and it didn't happen. On October 26, the UN brokered a ceasefire between Egypt and Israel, ultimately leading to the first peace agreement being signed between the 2 countries in 1979. Meanwhile, the ceasefire exposed Syria to military defeat, and Israel seized even more territory in the Golan Heights. Syria voted along with other Arab states in 1979 to expel Egypt from the Arab League. The overthrow of the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie took place on September 12 of 1974 in a coup initiated by a Marxist-Leninist faction in the military, and marked the beginning of a 17-year-long Ethiopian civil war, which formally ended in 1991. The war left at least 1.4 million dead. The Solomonic dynasty, also known as the House of Solomon, was the former ruling dynasty of the Ethiopian Empire. Haile Selassie was the last emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974. The full title traditionally of the emperors of Ethiopia was Elect of God, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, and the King of Kings of Ethiopia. The last Ethiopian emperor was apparently murdered in August of 1975 by the same Marxist army officers who had overthrown him the year before. The Iranian Revolution that took place in 1979 culminated in the overthrow of the last Shah of Iran, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on February 11th of 1979. To be replaced by the Islamic Republic of Iran with what is called a unitary theocratic republican authoritarian presidential system subject to a grand ayatollah. The revolution was supported by various Islamist and leftist organizations as well as student movements. So things changed considerably for the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran after 1979. This picture of the citizenry was taken in 2012. And these pictures were taken before the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. So in the 1970s, communist and Islamist forces took down hereditary rulers in Cambodia, Iran, and Ethiopia, leading to genocide, repression, and great suffering in the subsequent destabilization of these countries. The Georgia Guidestones were unveiled on March 22nd of 1980 on a rural site in Elbert County, Georgia. Engraved on each face of the 4 large upright stones in 8 different languages was a message containing 10 principles or guidelines. The very first guideline was maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. What was up with that? A reference to depopulation? The remaining guidelines sound positive, but are they really? Whoever was behind the Guidestones was unknown. There were apparent focuses of population control, eugenics, and internationalism engraved on the Guidestones. As of July 7th of 2022, the Georgia Guidestones are no more. One was mysteriously destroyed in an explosion, and the rest were subsequently demolished. In June of 1987, during a visit to West Berlin in a speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate, President Reagan challenged Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. The First Intifada began in the Gaza Strip and West Bank between Palestine and Israel on December 8th of 1987. The First Intifada was a sustained series of Palestinian protests and violent riots against the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank since 1967. More than 1 million Chinese protesters demanding greater democracy marched through Beijing between May 14th and 17th of 1989, leading to a crackdown. On June 4th, a crackdown took place in Beijing as the army approached the square. An unknown Chinese protester stood in front of a column of military tanks in Tiananmen Square on June 5th, temporarily halting the tanks. The incident took place on the morning after Chinese troops fired upon pro-democracy students who had been protesting in the square since April 15th of 1989. East Germany opened checkpoints in the Berlin Wall on November 9th of 1989, allowing its citizens to travel freely to West Germany for the first time in decades. The dissolution of the Soviet Union unfolded between 1988 and 1991. On January 22nd of 1990, the League of Communists of Yugoslavia voted to dissolve itself, and in its place, the former republics of Yugoslavia formed their own local branches: the Socialist Party of Serbia, the Party of Democratic Changes of Croatia, which merged with the Social Democrats of Croatia to become the Social Democratic Party of Croatia, the Social Democratic Union of Macedonia, the Party of Democratic Reforms of Slovenia, which was renamed to Social Democrats in 2005, the Social Democratic Party of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Democratic Party of Socialists of Montenegro. And the Democratic Socialists are still with us. This is the logo of the Democratic Socialists of America. They are very much active today and making inroads in current politics, like in the recent mayoral election in New York City. On June 13th of 1990, the official start of the destruction of the Berlin Wall by the East German border troops began and ended in December. It had been opened for passage through 7 months before it was officially taken down. The official day of the reunification of West and East Germany was October 3rd of 1990 and is celebrated as such as a national holiday every year. The first German federal election held since reunification was won by Helmut Kohl on December 2nd of 1990, who became the first chancellor of the newly reunified Germany. Socialist Slobodan Milosevic won the general election on December 9th of 1990 to become president of Serbia. On March 9th of 1991, 2 people were killed and tanks deployed in the streets when massive demonstrations took place in opposition to the newly elected president of the Socialist Republic of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, and his Socialist Party. Then on August 25th, Serbia attacked Vukovar in Croatia, launching the Battle of Vukovar, an 87-day siege of Vukovar in eastern Croatia. It pitted under 2,000 Croatian National Guard soldiers and civilian volunteers against the 36,000 soldiers of the Yugoslav National Army and Serbian paramilitaries equipped with heavy armor and artillery. During this time, it was the first European town to be entirely destroyed since the end of World War II, and the fiercest battle in Europe since then as well. When it ended in November of 1991, over 20,000 of its inhabitants were forced to leave, and hundreds of soldiers and civilians were killed, with most of its population being ethnically cleansed of its non-Serb population. The term ethnic cleansing came into use in the 20th century to mean the systematic forced removal or extermination of ethnic, racial, and/or religious groups from a given area, frequently with the intent of making the area ethnically homogeneous. That same year, on December 8th of 1991, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine signed the Belovezh Accords in Belarus, officially ending the Soviet Union and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. And on December 26th, the Supreme Soviet met for the last time, formally dissolving the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War. So around the same time the celebrated end of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, we already see civil wars, genocide, and ethnic cleansing occurring. This is not the progress one would expect from our historical narrative, and is instead the reverse of it. It would appear to be the immediate descent into chaos and violence from the departure of a centralized system of government, as well as chaos from communal violence as well. Today's present seems a lot like George Orwell's novel 1984, doesn't it? Does history repeat itself for randomly occurring reasons? Or does history repeat itself because it is being planned to bring in specific outcomes? We tend to imagine that times in the past were somehow better than in the present. And come to find out, horrors from our past are still in our present. It seems like we've been living in real-life applications of things like the Hegelian dialectic of problem-reaction-solution and Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. The controllers create the problem, get the reaction they desire, and then they provide the solution, which frequently involves taking away our freedoms for our own protection. Then they lie to us and gaslight us about what was really taking place, deflecting blame from themselves and projecting it on others. And that the masses are unknowingly victims of systematically applied methods of manipulation. I didn't know what the DHR factor was listed in the methods of manipulation here, so I looked it up. It is undetectable mind control. It is interesting what comes up to the surface when digging back through our relatively recent history and looking at it with new eyes. It's not hidden. They tell us without telling us what they are telling us, and they have been continuing on with the planning and implementation of their dark plans for all humanity right in front of our eyes. It certainly seems like there was something bigger going on with all of these activities behind the scenes, and that they were not random occurrences. I think we've been seeing the unfolding of a plan that definitely does not have the best interests of humanity at heart, and only benefits the power and control-hungry few that have been manipulating events behind the scenes. Our collective human consciousness has been continuously seeded with the notion we could meet a violent, horrible death randomly at any given moment by forces beyond our control, and genocide was committed on large numbers of people in populations where there was armed conflict around the world, and that somehow all of this is normal. Over the years, our awareness has been raised about false flags, defined as operations committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning blame on a second party. They have actually been telling us in a disguised way all along because they are required to tell us what they are doing in order to gain our consent because of our free will. So they have developed high-sounding ways to convince us that handing over our freedom is our own idea. Nazi Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels is famous for the following quotes. The parasitic and multidimensionally aware beings behind all of this want us to believe that suffering, sickness, misery, destruction, and death was and is our normal state of being, and not question what we've been taught about who we are. They are the only ones who benefit because they energetically feed on negative emotional states. At the same time, they have sucked up all the wealth of the earth for themselves. They've been working on getting us to this place for a very long time, but they've lost control of the narrative. It is interesting that from the beginning of the 1980s forward, the personal computer and internet came into being in our lives. Definitely a very important development for our mass awakening, and a way out of tyranny and the dystopian nightmare that was planned for us. Now, with the internet at our disposal, we can do our own research, connect with each other all over the world, and see what is happening in real time, unlike in the past. Censorship is certainly still with us, but it's kind of like whack-a-mole. You knock one down, but there's still plenty of moles popping up from other holes. All of this leads me to ask this question. Has the Earth's population been experiencing a very calculated and undeclared psychological war based on terror and trauma against all of humanity in our modern history to bring us to what is going on against humanity in the world in which we live in today? I think the answer is most definitely yes.